Two things we're going to talk about here, just the server architecture, and then we're going to do just a brief overview of SharePoint authentication. Authentication is another one of those really big topics, and it varies greatly by your installation. If you guys have specific questions about security and authentication inside your environments, feel free to shoot those over to me in an email, but unfortunately that's, again, one of those things that just has so many different options to it and such a wide variance across customers and folks in the class that we're not going to be able to go into a lot of detail inside of it here, but I'd be more than happy to discuss that with you offline if we need to. Okay. So let's get started and talk about server architecture. So here's a few terms for you guys that you're going to need to know, a few terms that I'm going to probably say over and over and over again. First one of those terms being the farm. So if you ever hear me say the term SharePoint farm, all we really mean is that's a collection of all the different pieces, all the different moving parts of SharePoint. So all the different SharePoint servers that go into this, all the different reports, SQL servers that go into building out and serving up the data that you see on the screen in the SharePoint environment, that is referred to as the SharePoint farm. Another term that you'll hear me use is something called an application server. You'll notice that's a little bit different from a database server here. An application server is something that runs a specific portion of SharePoint. So that may be the piece that handles your web front-end service that ultimately is what users connect to and handles the traffic between the different applications and brings the data back and shows it to your users. Or that may be something like your Excel services server, which we'll talk about, that actually handles rendering those Excel workbooks in the browser in order for them to show up on your screen. So an application server is simply a SharePoint server that runs a specific set of services. It can be one service or it can be multiple services that are all running on a single server. SQL Server hopefully is something that you guys have heard of before. SQL Server obviously is the Microsoft Relational Database System. We're going to actually be using SQL Server 2012 in this class, so all your virtual machines that you guys have to work on are all going to be SQL Server 2012. We'll talk a little bit about the back-end requirements here in just a moment because you can still leverage some of the older versions of SQL Server all the way back to even SQL Server 2008, and depending on which version of SharePoint you're running, you can even go back to SQL Server 2005 for some of the back-end functionality. So again, we're going to be running on SQL Server 2012, and of course the SQL Server 2014 release just happened very recently, so you guys also have the option to build that out on a development server to see how that's going to work out for you as well. Finally, a database server is simply a Windows server. In our case, it's Windows Server 2008 R2, or excuse me, Windows Server 2012 regular. All the VMs that we're going to be using are running Windows Server 2012. Again, does not have to be Windows Server 2012. We'll talk about that requirement here in just a moment as well. Okay, so just a couple of terms that you guys are going to hear over and over again. If you're unfamiliar with those at this point, just remember those as we go through the week here. All right, some hardware requirements. These are pretty loose requirements. If you go onto the MSDN documentation, you'll see all kinds of stuff out there where Microsoft says, well, this is what you should use. These are the recommendations that we make for a development server. These are the recommendations that we make for a small server farm and a large server farm. They actually have, and the reason why I don't put what they define as a small and medium and large farm and those kind of things on the slides for the class is because they tend to update those as hardware changes and as the different releases of Windows come out and all those kind of things. So there is an MSDN page out there though that would give you some general recommendations. So for what we're doing here, if you want to have a single server, just a minimum development server, 8 cores or 8 gigs of RAM is probably going to be the minimum that you want. 4 cores of processor, and then 80 gigabytes. You'll see that's kind of a common theme all the way down is the 80 gigs of hard drive space. So that's going to be what you need to basically get your SharePoint server by itself up and running. Keep in mind that first line there, just for SharePoint, not involving SQL Server at that point. The second line that you guys see there is that single server, development server with all the services. So that's everything for SharePoint as well as all of the SQL Server pieces for the back end as well. Okay. Again, the recommendation there pops up to 24 gigs just because we have both SQL Server running there, we have IIS, all those kind of services in the background running, as well as all the different SharePoint components as well. Now, the last three here, these are the production side of things. So if you have just a single server that's running just the web front end, or a single server that's running just as an application server, so again, the application server being those things like Excel services that run your Excel workbooks or Performance Point, those kind of things. The minimum recommendation there is 12 gigs of memory, and again, the 4-core server there. So that's kind of where your production entry level starts. I can tell you this, the more memory that you can put on your SharePoint VMs or your SharePoint hardware in general, the better performance that you're going to get out of it. So the VM that I actually have running here on my computer is, it's an 8 gig, I'm running 8 gigabytes of memory and 2 cores on my laptop here, just to kind of give you guys a little bit of an idea as to the performance that you would get out of something like that. So it's a VM running on my computer. I do have a solid-state drive in this particular laptop, but we're running 8 gigs of memory and a 2-core virtual machine. Okay, and here's where we get into that side where I said, you know, Microsoft kind of changes the recommendations based on servers and hardware and all those kind of things. Whenever, I think currently the small server farm is defined as less than 1,000 users. So if you're looking at less than 1,000 users hitting your SharePoint farm, then the general recommendation is a minimum of 8 gigabytes of memory just for the SQL Server, just for the database server. If you go up to a medium farm, that's anywhere from about 1,000 users up to 10,000 users. Would be 16 gigs, and then beyond that is, again, however much memory you can throw at it. I would say probably at least 24 gigs of memory there, and then that's when you probably want to start thinking about scaling out and adding additional SQL servers probably at that point. Okay, so just general hardware recommendations here. Obviously, the more hardware you throw at it, the better your performance is going to be up to a certain point. Over on the software side, the first thing that might pop out at you guys is that both of these say 64-bit. So with the 2000, I want to say it was the 2013 releases where they started doing this, but SharePoint is now 64-bit only. So there is no longer a 32-bit version of SharePoint. So we have to have 64-bit Windows. That can be Windows Server 2008 R2 or later. Again, keep in mind this is for the SharePoint 2013 environment. I believe SharePoint 2010, the requirement is Server 2008 or later. If you guys are curious about some of the 2010 requirements, let me know, and I can certainly get some more concrete numbers for you on those. So 64-bit Windows Server 2008 R2 or later. Caveat here being that it does not currently, SharePoint 2013 does not currently support Windows Server 2012 R2. That is a Service Pack 1 release. That was it's slated for the Service Pack 1 release, which I believe is out now, although I have not tested to make sure that it actually installs properly on Windows Server 2012 R2. So I would say that currently, just to be safe, you probably want to stop at Windows Server 2012. Don't go to the R2 version. Run into all kinds of problems whenever you try to run that installer there. On the SQL Server side, as I mentioned, this is where things kind of get fragmented a little bit. The back-end requirement just for the database engine and those pieces is 64-bit SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 or later. The reason why I say things get fragmented at this point is because that's only the database engine where all the content databases are stored. We can have SQL Server, the content databases running on a SQL Server 2008 instance, whereas we can have reporting services in the same farm running 2012 reporting services, and we can also have PowerPivot inside that same farm running in 2008 R2 or 2012. So that things kind of go a little bit different direction there, but this is just for the SQL Server for the SharePoint content databases only. Okay, and finally, .NET 4.5, Framework 4.5. Certain functionality inside SharePoint will require Silverlight, but that is a client-side requirement, so keep that in mind as you're going through here as well. So there are a couple of things in SharePoint that do require Silverlight, and I'll point some of those out along the way here. Okay. All right, so a couple of things server architecture-wise. You're going to hear me say several times, single server or multi-server. And then finally, you see on there we have PowerPivot for SharePoint. So single server versus multi-server. Best way to describe this is kind of a single server farm is everything on a single Windows server, kind of just like the name would suggest. So all of your applications are on one server. On that same server, you would have any of your PowerPivot or your analysis services instances, and all your databases would be stored on there as well. The virtual machines that you guys are going to be working with are all single server. So everything that you need is all contained on a single server. The virtual machine that I'm going to be doing demos with for you guys this week is also just a single server. So it's a one Windows VM. I'll show you guys some of the pieces to it here in just a moment, just to get everybody familiar with what we're working with. But it's all a single server environment. All my SharePoint, all my SQL Server is all on the same Windows server. When we start talking about multi-server, though, you get into these, you'll hear people say things like a two-tier farm or a three-tier farm, perhaps. So a two-tier farm, this is kind of your first level of a multi-server farm. A two-tier farm means that all my application pieces are going to be on one server, and all my database and all my backend are going to be separated onto a second server. So I have two tiers. One is my application tier. That's got all my SharePoint pieces on it. And my second tier is my database level, or my database tier, and that's where all of my content databases and things like PowerPivot would be running. Okay. If you want to get some more performance, you can always, or you just need to scale things, you can always go over to a three-tier farm. Here you see that we've now got all of our applications are housed on server number 1, all of our analysis services pieces. So we've basically taken the layer number 2, that server number 2, and we split it into two pieces. All of our analysis services, PowerPivot is on one server now, and all of our actual content databases for SharePoint that are used to run SharePoint are stored on that third server. So the only difference between a two-tier farm here and a three-tier farm is just separating it out onto separating my analysis services pieces onto a separate server. So just because another thing that you'll hear often is an alternate setup for this three-tier farm. The three-tier farm isn't necessarily, it's not really a specific combination of services on any particular server. It just means that I'm separating out my applications from my database from different portions of the farm. This is probably this alternate three-tier farm that you guys see on the screen here right now. This is probably the most common way to separate the services inside of your SharePoint farm. You'll have one or more servers running that web tier. Again, that's the piece that serves up the web pages to people. So those are the servers that the URL is going to go to. Those servers would then connect over to your application tier, and that's where things like central administration would run. That's where your things like Excel services would run. All that would be on one or more servers in the application tier. And then finally, all of our databases would be stored on another set of servers in the back end. So again, this is probably the most common, having the web front end separated from your applications, separated from your database there. Okay. So as we break out these different pieces, that's a term everybody's probably heard before, is scaling. So ultimately what we're doing here is we're scaling our environment from probably starting with one or two servers, starting very, very small with just a couple of servers, and then we're going to go out to 3 servers, and then we're going to go to 4 servers, and so on and so forth. The reason why we would do something like this is, as you can probably imagine, as we add more hardware and we separate some of these services out, we're going to be able to get some better performance out of them. So think of it like this. If I have one web front end, as you see here, web front end 1 minus n, so the number of web front ends I have here. If I start with one web front end and I've only got 10 users hitting it, I probably don't have a problem. If I have one web front end and in 6 months from now I roll out a bunch of new applications and I've now gone from 10 users hitting it to 10,000 users hitting it, I'm probably going to see some performance degradation on my web front end server being able to control all that traffic. So I'd want to be able to add multiple web front ends into my solution to handle the additional traffic and then use things like network load balancing in order to distribute that workload across all those servers. It's the same thing with our application tier here as well. So you see on the left-hand side there, we've only got one server that's running all of our Excel services, all of our reporting services, and all of our PowerPivot services. Whereas over on the right-hand side, once we get a lot of users using Excel, we might need 2 Excel services servers. So again, there's all kinds of pieces that you're going to see that run in the background that serve up these workbooks into the web page, into the web browser for you. And if I've only got 5 or 10 users that are loading Excel workbooks up in the browser, it's probably not a big deal. But once I get a few thousand or tens of thousands of users all trying to load Excel workbooks at the same time, it's going to put a lot of load on that Excel services server. So I may need to break out Excel services either onto its own server, or I may need to add additional Excel services servers into my environment. Same thing goes for all the different applications that we're going to look at. If you're using a lot of performance point dashboards, you may need to have multiple performance point servers running in the background. Okay? So ultimately, all of the services, all the scaling, that's the word I'm looking for, scaling, is ultimately just to get some better performance out of our environment. Okay. Speaking of our environment, let me go ahead and just show you guys real quick what we're going to be working with. So we'll hop out of our slides here for just a moment, and we'll go over to my virtual machine. So I have a VM set up here. Again, this is very, very similar to the one that you guys are going to be using. I believe yours, the server name is also even called SP2013, if I remember correctly. You'll have a couple of links up here at the top of the screen. You'll have a link to central administration. You guys are all administrators on these machines. You're going to have the administrator login. The password, if it's not in the emails, is going to be just pass@word1. Let me actually type that in the chat box here for you guys. Word1. And I'll put that in the email this afternoon, but just in case anybody misses that, password's there in the chat box, just all lowercase pass the @ symbol word1. Okay, so you guys, like I said, I'll have a couple of links up here at the top. The first one's going to be for central administration. I've got a copy of all the completed labs already on your virtual machines for you, so if you guys get stuck with anything, you can always hop over to the completed labs to see what it's supposed to look like all the way in the final solution there. And then you should have a link. I believe you have a link just to a straight Business Intelligence Center, kind of like the one that we're looking at here, which is ultimately what we're going to create and work on this week. Okay. We also have central administration. We'll hop into this one here a little bit more in just a moment. But the other piece that I want to show you guys is the SQL Server backend. So we have all the SharePoint pieces on here. Central administration, again, already set up and already configured for you guys on your VMs. We'll look at those in a little bit more detail here in just a moment. Over on the SQL Server side, on each of these virtual machines, we have a single instance on our database engine here. So if I just connect to my local host, you'll notice here's all my databases. You'll have the AdventureWorks 2012 and AdventureWorks DW 2012 databases on your VMs as well. That's where we will be pulling in most of our data as we work throughout the week. And then you'll notice that there's a bunch of other databases inside of here, and these are all different items that support our SharePoint environment. So I have a performance point database here that's obviously for performance points, same thing with PowerPivot and reporting services for those services respectively. SharePoint admin content, that's going to be the one that houses all of our central administration content. SharePoint config, WSS logging, and WSS content are all for our SharePoint config is a configuration database for SharePoint, stores all kinds of server information, those kind of things. And WSS content is where all of our content is going to be stored. So anytime you upload an Excel workbook, it would get stored into that content database there. Okay, so we have just a single database instance here, no named instance on that one. On the other side for analysis services though, what you notice here in my little drop down, and let me actually start up, zoom it here. Oops. Okay, so what you notice here in my drop-down is that I actually have 3 different instances of analysis services. This very bottom one here, just the non-named instance, the default instance, this one here is going to be your multi-dimensional. So that's my multi-dimensional instance. Obviously, the one that's called tabular. Hopefully you guys can guess that that's going to be my tabular instance. And this last one up here at the top, that's called PowerPivot, which we'll get into a little bit more tomorrow, is going to house all my PowerPivot workbooks. So if I connect over to my local one, just my regular local host, this is going to have all the analysis services information that you guys are going to need throughout the week in my AdventureWorks DW 2012 multidimensional version of the database. And again, all those are already deployed onto your virtual machines as well. If you guys do get curious and you want to, you're always welcome to go in here and connect over to any of these different data sources. I do have a couple of tabular workbooks out on your virtual machines for you to look at there as well, if you're interested in the tabular models at all. Okay. So again, we'll talk about that PowerPivot one a little bit more tomorrow. You can notice, if you look here, we'll talk about this tomorrow as well, but you notice that the icons are a little bit different for my multi-dimensional versus my tabular instance there inside of Management Studio. Okay. Does anybody have any questions so far? All right, so far so good. All righty. So SharePoint authentication, this was the kind of the topic that I mentioned was a little bit out of scope for the week. Everything that we're going to be doing here is actually going to be using Windows authentication. So all the BI, or a lot of the BI services anyway, are going to require Windows credentials to be passed between different pieces of our environment here. Analysis services only has authentication with Active Directory, so it only supports Windows authentication. There's no like SQL Server authentication for something like that. So we do need to be able to pass Windows credentials around. Something that is going to come into the conversation, especially if you're in the 2010 environment, is going to be the fact that Kerberos might be involved. So hopefully that's not going to scare everybody away. We're not going to talk about setting up Kerberos in this class at all. That's a much larger conversation than we would have time for this week. But I will show you some cool things here in the 2013 environment that are actually going to get us around the requirement for Kerberos. So we don't necessarily have to have Kerberos here in 2013 any longer. We have the ability to work around that to a certain extent with Excel services as well as with Performance Point.